Schrödinger's Chat, the podcast where I explore the real science behind the biggest questions in the universe, as well as some of the quirkier science we encounter every day. I'm Anna, a sixth form physics student with a lot of curiosity and a passion for understanding how the world works. From the smallest particles to the largest galaxies, join me as we unlock the mysteries and wonders of the universe and explore how physics shapes the world around us. Today, we're diving into the weird and wonderful world of science fiction. In fact, I'd like to start a sort of series within this podcast where we take a look at the physics behind some of the most iconic sci-fi movies across a few episodes. We'll explore how real physics shapes these stories, where the filmmakers took some creative liberties, and why science fiction can inspire real scientific curiosity. Episode 1, Star Wars. Okay, before we get started, a slight disclaimer. I am a big Star Wars fan, and in examining the physics, I am in no way trying to take away from the enjoyability or quality of the saga, so put your lightsabers back down and chill out, and let's get stuck into some science. To get us started on this journey, let's jump into hyperspace. Pun intended. Star Wars is full of daring escapes, often achieved by suddenly jumping into hyperspace at the very last minute after finally managing to fix the ship's hyperdrive, narrowly avoiding another deadly attack from the Empire. I mean, you know the scene. Han Solo flips and switches, the stars stretch, and boom, the Millennium Falcon suddenly jumps halfway across the galaxy. But is this actually possible? Well, let's start really simple. The fastest thing in the universe is light, which travels at about 300 million meters per second. Nothing can travel faster than this. It's the universal speed limit, if you will. The reason we cannot travel faster than the speed of light is rooted in the fundamental principles of Einstein's theory of relativity. According to this theory, space and time are unified into a single entity called space-time, and every object moves through space-time at the speed of light. So a stationary object is moving through time at the speed of light, while an object moving through space at the speed of light has no movement through time. This means that the maximum speed an object can move through space is the speed of light, and all motion through space-time is constrained by this limit. Another key factor is the relationship between mass, energy, and velocity. So as an object approaches the speed of light, its relativistic mass increases, requiring more and more energy to accelerate further, meaning it would take infinite energy to actually reach the speed of light. So, kind of a problem. The closest humans have come to the speed of light is by accelerating individual atomic particles, specifically electrons, to 99.9999896% of the speed of light, and this happens within the Large Hadron Collider. These particles are essentially massless, which allows them to reach such high velocities. Okay, so while this is an incredibly high percentage, it's still far from reaching the actual speed of light, which is a theoretical limit. And as we said, these are for particles that are essentially massless, and we're talking about a spaceship, which is much larger, much heavier. So what's the fastest we can accelerate something that is not massless? Well, the fastest human-made object is the Parker Solar Probe, and this is a spacecraft that is designed to study the Sun, and it utilises the Sun's gravity to slingshot itself to really high speeds. And it has reached 0.05% of the speed of light, which really gives you some perspective of how far we are from accelerating a man-made object or a spacecraft to this speed. That said, some theoretical physics ideas do play around with fast sunlight travel, and one of them is the Alcubierre drive. This was proposed by Mexican theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre, hence the name, and this is a hypothetical warp drive. So this would work by compressing space in front of a spaceship and expanding the space behind a spaceship. So you're not moving through space faster than light, you're moving space itself. It's kind of like surfing a wave of space-time where the space around you is moving but you yourself are stationary. Since a ship is not moving, the conventional effects that we just discussed from relativity would not apply, so the rules of space-time and the laws of relativity would not be violated. However, to do it, you need something called negative energy or exotic matter. These are hypothetical forms of matter that possess unusual properties such as negative energy density and negative pressure, and physicists don't really know what it is or if it's even possible. So, hyperspace is a cool idea and maybe very loosely inspired by science, but at the moment, we're nowhere near achieving that. Okay, next up, weapons. And let's start with one of the most legendary weapons in Star Wars, if not of all time, lightsabers. So, in Star Wars lore, a lightsaber is some sort of light or plasma blade powered by a kyber crystal. Fortunately on Earth, we don't have kyber crystals. It's a fictional element that belongs solely to the Star Wars galaxy. And lightsabers in Star Wars can clash with other lightsabers as well as slicing through all sorts of materials from solid metal to people. Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Firstly, plasma. So, plasma is commonly referred to as the fourth state of matter. So, we have solid, liquid, gas, and then there's plasma. It's ionized gas or gas containing charged particles, and it emits light due to the process of excitation and de-excitation of electrons within the plasma. So, when a plasma is formed, it consists of ions and free electrons that are in a high energy state. These electrons can collide with atoms or molecules, transferring energy and exciting the electrons to higher energy levels. When these excited electrons return to their lower energy states, they release energy in the form of photons, which we perceive as light. Alright, now we know what a lightsaber would hypothetically be made of. How do we make a blade? Well, the problem is plasma disperses quickly without containment, and from a visual aspect, light doesn't just stop after a meter or so to look like a limited blade or saber. So, how do we contain plasma? Well, this is actually something we can already do on Earth. The way to contain plasma is to trap it in a magnetic field, which we do in fusion reactors. However, in a simple straight magnetic field, the plasma would be free to stream out the ends, so we have to use something called a tokamak. The word tokamak is an acronym derived from the Russian words for toroidal magnetic confinement. Now, the word toroidal refers to the shape of the magnetic field, which is a torus, which is basically a donut shape. So, a toroidal field, a donut-shaped magnetic field, is produced by coils that surround a vacuum chamber which the plasma is contained in. Now, the plasma has to be in a vacuum chamber to prevent it from being cooled by interactions with air molecules. Because the plasma and magnetic field is formed in the closed shape of the torus, we're able to confine the plasma. However, unfortunately for our lightsaber building quest, the energy required to sustain a plasma-based blade would be enormous, and current battery technology is insufficient to support a device like this. Even if we could produce this power source, the amount of cooling technology required to keep it running would be ridiculously big. It would probably make using a lightsaber completely impractical. On the subject of using a lightsaber, we come across a few other issues as well. With a blade of light, we couldn't actually have epic duels. In Star Wars, lightsabers are able to make contact with other lightsabers, but photons do not interact with each other in a way that would allow them to clash or block each other. And even with our plasma blade, the superheated conditions that we need to create plasma would probably mean a lightsaber would be incredibly dangerous to use, even for the person wielding it, not just the enemy. Having said all that, only Force wielders use lightsabers in Star Wars, so perhaps we too could make one if we had the power of the Force, but I guess we're just not as cool as that on Earth. Let's move on to another Star Wars weapon, the Death Star. Maybe the most terrifying Star Wars weapon. So, in Star Wars, the Death Star is a space station and super weapon created by the Galactic Empire and is capable of obliterating entire planets with a super laser style weapon. So, is Earth at risk of being Death Starred? Well, to destroy a planet, you have to overcome something called the gravitational binding energy. And this is basically the energy that holds a planet together, or the amount of energy needed to disperse all the mass of a planet against its own gravity. For Earth, you would require a monumental amount of energy to do this. It would be about 2.25 times 10 to the 32 joules of energy to destroy Earth. Now, the ability to generate such a colossal amount of energy is way beyond our current technology, so luckily for us, Earth is safe from Death Star attacks for now. The other problem posed by creating a Death Star is just the sheer scale of it. In Star Wars lore, the original Death Star was 160 kilometers in diameter. To give you an idea of the scale, our moon is about 3,475 kilometers in diameter, and the International Space Station is 109 meters long. So, the Death Star, despite its moon or planet-like appearance, is just a space station. But again, we're not talking about just 160 kilometers long of a thin space station, more like the ISS. We're talking about 160 kilometers in diameter of a massive sphere. So that's a massive surface area of volume. Even if it isn't as large as the moon, it's still a phenomenal engineering undertaking if we were to create it. But that doesn't stop it from being a terror, because in Star Wars, it's still an imposing threat. Some Star Destroyers, which are other ships in Star Wars, were up to 19 kilometers in length and 60 kilometers in wingspan, which is huge, but it still barely touches the 160 kilometer diameter of the Death Star. So, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty glad that the engineering skill is kind of not there yet for us to create that kind of thing. It's one thing to create a lightsaber, but quite another to create a planet destroyer, so I'm pretty happy something like that doesn't exist. Now let's have a look at spaceships, of which Star Wars is full of. X-Wings, TIE Fighters, the Millennium Falcon, all super cool ships, but they have a few fundamental issues. Perhaps the biggest one, gravity. In Star Wars, people walk around normally, they don't wear seatbelts, drinks stay in cups, so obviously there's artificial gravity, right? Well, not quite. To simulate gravity on a spaceship, you would need to create a centripetal force. Now you could do this by spinning the ship or part of the ship that the astronauts or Star Wars characters were on. The surface that they were standing on would apply a centripetal force on them to keep them travelling in a circular path. So they would be accelerating towards the centre of the spaceship or space station, but they would experience a feeling of being pushed outwards to the walls or the floor of the spaceship due to inertia, which is a tendency of an object to continue in its current state of motion. The centripetal acceleration is described by a formula where centripetal acceleration equals velocity squared over the radius of rotation. So, the faster the spaceship spins, or the smaller the radius of rotation, the greater the centripetal acceleration felt by the person. So by adjusting these variables, we could adjust the amount of simulated gravity, and I guess that means we could create a centripetal acceleration equal to the acceleration due to gravity on Earth. So our Star Wars characters would feel the same amount of acceleration as they would if they were standing on Earth. Now, while Star Wars ships don't seem to have a plausible method for artificial gravity, other sci-fi films do, such as Interstellar or The Martian, which we will look at in later episodes of the science behind the sci-fi series that I want to start with in this podcast, so stick around for those. Another fictitious aspect of Star Wars ships is, unfortunately, the sound. Space is a vacuum, so there are no particles to allow sound waves to travel, so unfortunately all those iconic TIE Fighter noises would be silent. But that wouldn't make very good cinema, so I think we can ignore that. And if we're being really picky, we could also comment on the streamlined shapes of many Star Wars ships. X-Wings, Star Destroyers, they all have wings and pointed fronts of the ships, but in space there is no air resistance, so they don't really need to be streamlined, so fighter craft with wings are not technically required. However, they don't necessarily take away from the function of a spaceship. And even in real life, sometimes spaceships are designed like this anyway to minimise the surface area for them to be damaged by space junk, or I guess in Star Wars, asteroids, whatever is in space that could damage a ship. So for aesthetic purposes and cool factor, I think we can allow that imperfection. Okay, so maybe Star Wars isn't the most scientifically accurate sci-fi franchise out there, but arguably it's not trying to be. It's space opera, not hard sci-fi. But what makes it exciting is that many of its wildest ideas are inspired in real physics. Plasma, space travel, energy, they may be exaggerated, but they inspire curiosity. Science fiction takes us beyond our limits, but often starts with real physics. It inspires our imagination, and at the same time, it teaches us the limits of physics. And I think it forces us to think more critically about what might be possible and what is just fantasy. Also, what we deem to be science fiction changes as we progress our understanding of how the universe works and develop our technology. For example, mobile phones were once science fiction, so were video calls, AI, and virtual reality, and now they're a common part of our everyday life. In fact, Martin Cooper, the engineer who invented the first handheld mobile phone in 1973, has stated that the communicator device that folds shut and is used by Captain Kirk on Star Trek actually inspired his work on the flip phone model of mobile phones. For me, as an aspiring physicist, I think sci-fi isn't always about getting everything right. It's about asking what if, forcing us to question the universe, have big imaginations, and sometimes those questions may lead to the start of the next biggest discoveries. Well, that's all for this first ever episode. Be sure to stay tuned for the next one and look out for the next episode in this sci-fi series. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, stay curious and may the force and the physics be with you. Bye!